In the harsh Texas plains of 1883, desperation drives people to make choices they never imagined. Evelyn Carr, a 40-year-old widow carrying the weight of a scandal that destroyed her reputation, stands on her weathered porch watching vultures circle overhead. Her small ranch is all that remains of the life she once knew, and now even that sanctuary faces threats from men who see her isolation as weakness. The railroad is coming, and with it, opportunities for those bold enough to seize them. But Evelyn isn't bold. She's broken, shunned by the very community that once embraced her. When survival demands the unthinkable, she approaches Jack McCrae, a young cowboy with calloused hands and secrets of his own. What she asks him will shock you, but what he answers will change everything you thought you knew about love, redemption, and the courage it takes to start over. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind carried dust and memories across the barren stretch of land that Evelyn Carr now called home, though home felt like too generous a word for what remained. 3 years had passed since the scandal broke. 3 years since the good people of Cedar Falls had decided she was no longer welcome in their parlors, their shops, or their prayers. 3 years since she'd become a ghost haunting her own life. Evelyn pulled her shawl tighter against the morning chill and stepped down from the porch, her boots crunching on the hard-packed earth. The sound echoed in the vast emptiness that surrounded her modest ranch, 40 acres of stubborn grass and struggling cattle, bordered by mesquite and memories. It wasn't much, but it was hers, bought with the last of Thomas's savings and the sale of everything they'd owned in town. Thomas, even now, 4 years after his death, she could feel his presence in the way the barn door hung crooked, in the unfinished fence posts he'd meant to replace, in the garden plot where his careful hands had once coaxed tomatoes and beans from reluctant soil. Their marriage had been brief, barely 2 years, but it had been the happiest time of her life. He'd been a gentleman, a thoughtful man, with strong hands and kind eyes that saw past the sharp tongue and independent spirit that had kept other suitors at bay. She'd been 36 when they married, already considered past her prime by the town's standards. But Thomas hadn't cared about their whispered concerns or raised eyebrows. He'd courted her with quiet determination, bringing her books from his travels and sitting on her father's porch, talking about everything from cattle prices to the poetry of Walt Whitman. When he'd asked for her hand, she'd said yes without hesitation, despite the small voice in her head that warned her happiness was too fragile to last. The voice had been right. Thomas had died in a wagon accident on the road to Austin, his neck broken when his horse spooked at a snake. The funeral had been well attended. He'd been liked and respected in Cedar Falls. People had brought casseroles and condolences, had patted her hand and spoken of God's mysterious ways. For a few months, she'd been the grieving widow, deserving of sympathy and support. Then Margaret Hutchins had started talking. Margaret, with her pinched face and sharp eyes, had always resented Evelyn's independence. She'd been particularly vocal about the impropriety of a woman Thomas's age marrying someone so much younger, never mind that Evelyn had been 36 to his 42. But Margaret's real ammunition had come later, when she'd somehow gotten hold of the letters. The letters Thomas had written during his brief courtship, before their marriage. Letters that spoke of desire and longing in language that Margaret deemed scandalous. Letters that, when shared with the right people in the right way, painted Evelyn as a woman of loose morals who had seduced a good man into an unseemly marriage. It didn't matter that the letters had been written by a man to his intended bride. It didn't matter that they'd been married properly in the church with the blessing of Reverend Patterson. It didn't matter that their brief union had been happy and faithful. What mattered was that Margaret Hutchins had found a way to destroy Evelyn's reputation, and in a town like Cedar Falls, reputation was everything. The ostracism had been swift and thorough. Invitations stopped coming, shopkeepers became coldly polite. Children were called away when she approached. Even the church, where she'd worshipped since childhood, became a place of whispered conversations and pointed looks. Reverend Patterson, who had performed her marriage ceremony, suddenly found it difficult to meet her eyes. Within a year, Evelyn had sold the house in town and moved to the ranch. It was meant to be temporary, a place to retreat and heal while the gossip died down. But gossip, she'd learned, had a longer life than most things in Cedar Falls, and now, 3 years later, she was no longer the grieving widow deserving of sympathy. She was the scandal-ridden woman who lived alone on the outskirts of town, a cautionary tale mothers told their daughters about the consequences of improper behavior. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent most of her adult life being exactly what Cedar Falls expected: proper, reserved, careful. She'd kept house for her aging father until his death, had helped with church suppers and charitable works, had minded her own business and spoken well of her neighbors. Her brief marriage to Thomas had been the one time she'd allowed herself to be truly happy, truly herself, and for that sin she was now paying the price. The ranch kept her busy enough during the day. There were always chores, cattle to tend, repairs to make, accounts to balance. She'd learned to do things Thomas had once handled, had developed calluses on her hands and a permanent squint from working in the sun. The work was hard, but it was honest, and it kept her mind occupied. It was the evenings that were difficult, when the silence pressed in and the weight of her isolation settled on her shoulders like a yoke. She'd hidden Thomas's ring in a tin box under the floorboards of their bedroom, wrapped in one of his handkerchiefs. Sometimes, on the worst nights, she'd take it out and hold it, remembering the weight of it on her finger, the way it had caught the light during those brief, perfect months when she'd been a wife instead of a pariah. The sound of approaching hoofbeats pulled her from her reverie. A rider was coming up the dusty track that led to her ranch, and Evelyn's stomach tightened with familiar dread. Visitors were rare, and they usually brought bad news. The man who dismounted from his horse was someone she recognized, but didn't know well, one of the railroad surveyors who had been working in the area for the past month. He was young, probably in his 20s, with the kind of confident bearing that came from having important business to conduct. "Mrs. Carr," he called out, approaching with his hat in his hand. "I'm Jim Bradley from the Houston and Texas Central Railroad. I was hoping we might have a word." Evelyn nodded, though every instinct told her to send him away. "What can I do for you, Mr. Bradley?" "Well, ma'am, I'm sure you've heard about the railroad coming through. We're mapping the route now, and I wanted to discuss the possibility of purchasing a portion of your land." The words hit her like a physical blow. She'd heard the rumors. Of course, everyone had. The railroad was coming to Cedar Falls, bringing with it the promise of progress and prosperity. But she'd assumed her remote ranch would be safe from such considerations. "I'm not interested in selling," she said quietly. Bradley's smile was practiced, professional. "I understand your hesitation, Mrs. Carr, but I think you'll find our offer quite generous. And frankly, it would be in your best interest to consider it seriously. The railroad has certain rights, and if we can't reach an agreement—" He let the threat hang in the air, unspoken but clear. Evelyn felt her chest tighten with a familiar mixture of anger and fear. All her life, men had been telling her what was in her best interest, what she should do, how she should behave. And now, when she had so little left, they wanted to take even that away. "I said I'm not interested," she repeated, her voice stronger now. "This is my home, Mr. Bradley. My husband and I built this life here, and I'm not leaving." Bradley's expression hardened slightly. "I'm sorry to hear that, ma'am. But I should warn you there are other parties interested in this land. Men who might not be as diplomatic in their approach as the railroad company. It would be wise to consider your options carefully." After he left, Evelyn sat on her porch steps and stared out at the vast expanse of sky and grass that surrounded her. The vultures were still circling, dark shapes against the pale blue of the morning. She thought about Thomas, about the dreams they'd shared for this place, about the life they'd planned to build together. She thought about Margaret Hutchins and her poisonous tongue, about the good people of Cedar Falls who had been so quick to judge and so slow to forgive. And she thought about the young cowboy she'd seen in town the past few weeks, Jack McCrae, they called him. He was new to the area, a drifter who'd found work at the Riverside Ranch. She'd heard whispers about him too, about his drinking, his temper, his mysterious past. But she'd also seen him in town, had watched the way he carried himself, the way he treated the horses he worked with, the quiet respect he showed, even to those who clearly looked down on him. The idea that was forming in her mind was desperate, probably foolish, certainly scandalous. But as she sat there watching the vultures circle and thinking about the threats that seemed to be closing in from all sides, Evelyn realized that desperation might be her only option. She'd lost everything once to the judgment of others. She wasn't about to lose it again without a fight. The sun was climbing higher now, burning off the morning chill and promising another day of relentless heat. Evelyn stood up, brushed the dust from her skirt, and looked out at the land that had become both her refuge and her prison. Somewhere in town, Jack McCrae was probably tending to his horses, unaware that his quiet presence had sparked an idea that would change both their lives forever. She had a proposal to make. The railroad survey stakes appeared 3 days later, driven into her land like wooden daggers, marking territory that was no longer entirely her own. Evelyn discovered them at dawn while checking on her cattle, bright red flags fluttering in the morning breeze like warnings of what was to come. Each stake bore official markings, numbers, and symbols that meant nothing to her, but everything to the men who would soon arrive to claim what they wanted. She counted 12 stakes total, cutting a diagonal line across her property from the northeast corner to the southern boundary. The proposed route would take her best pasture, the creek that fed her cattle, and the small grove of oak trees where she and Thomas had planned to build a larger house someday. The surveyors had been thorough, efficient, and utterly indifferent to the fact that they were carving up someone's life. Evelyn pulled one of the stakes from the ground, surprised by how deeply it had been driven into the hard earth. The wood was smooth, official, stamped with the Houston and Texas Central Railroad Company logo. She held it in her hands, feeling its weight, understanding that this simple piece of wood represented forces far beyond her ability to resist. The sound of approaching riders made her look up sharply. 3 men on horseback were crossing her land, moving with the kind of casual confidence that spoke of men who considered themselves above the niceties of permission or courtesy. The leader was a large man with graying hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to getting his way. Behind him rode 2 younger men, their hands resting casually on their gun belts. "Mrs. Carr," the leader called out as they approached. "I'm Silas Brennan. I believe Jim Bradley mentioned I might be calling on you." Evelyn had heard the name Brennan was a land speculator who had been buying up property around Cedar Falls for months, always at prices that seemed too good to refuse. Those who had initially declined his offers had eventually reconsidered, usually after experiencing various forms of misfortune that made selling seem like the wisest course of action. "Mr. Brennan," she replied, keeping her voice steady despite the fear that was building in her chest. "You're on my land without permission." Brennan's smile was cold, practiced. "Your land. That's what we need to discuss, Mrs. Carr. You see, the railroad's coming through, and that changes things. This property is going to be valuable, very valuable. I'm prepared to make you an offer that would set you up comfortably somewhere else. I'm not interested in selling." "I was afraid you'd say that." Brennan dismounted from his horse, his movements deliberate and threatening. "You know, Mrs. Carr, you're in a precarious position out here. A woman alone, with no family, no real friends in town. Accidents happen to isolated folks. Property gets damaged. Cattle wander off. Sometimes people just disappear." The threat was delivered with the same pleasant tone he might use to discuss the weather. Evelyn felt her mouth go dry, but she forced herself to stand straighter, to meet his gaze directly. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Brennan? I'm offering you a business opportunity. What you do with that opportunity is up to you." He gestured to the stakes scattered around them. "But I should mention that the railroad's route is already decided. This land will be taken one way or another. You can be compensated fairly for it, or you can lose it for nothing. The choice is yours." After they left, Evelyn sat on her porch steps and stared at the survey stake she still held in her hands. The wood was scarred now where she'd gripped it too tightly, her fingernails leaving small crescents in the smooth surface. She thought about Thomas, about how he would have handled this situation. He'd been a peaceable man, but he'd also been strong, respected. People would have listened to him, worked with him. They wouldn't have dared to threaten him the way Brennan had just threatened her. But Thomas was gone, and she was alone. The ride to town took her through the main street of Cedar Falls, past the church where she'd once worshipped, past the general store where she'd once been welcome, past the houses where she'd once been invited for tea and conversation. Now she rode through like a ghost, drawing stares and whispers, but no offers of help or friendship. She stopped first at the sheriff's office, though she held little hope that Jake Morrison would be willing to help her. Morrison was a decent man, but he was also practical, and getting involved in a dispute between a railroad company and a woman with a ruined reputation wasn't the kind of practical he favored. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Carr," he said after she'd explained about Brennan's visit. "But the man didn't actually threaten you, did he? Not in so many words. And even if he had, well, it's your word against his. These railroad men, they've got lawyers and money and influence, unless you've got proof of wrongdoing." He let the sentence trail off, but his meaning was clear. Even if she had proof, he wasn't sure he'd be willing to act on it. She was on her own. Her next stop was the bank, where she hoped to discuss a loan that might help her hire men to protect her property. But Thomas Whitmore, the bank president, was equally unhelpful. Her accounts were too small, her collateral too uncertain. The bank couldn't take the risk of lending to someone in her position, especially not against the interests of the railroad company. By the time she reached the church, her last hope was wearing thin. Reverend Patterson received her in his study, his manner polite but distant. He listened to her story with the patient expression of a man who had heard many troubles and could solve few of them. "I'll pray for you, Mrs. Carr," he said finally, "but I'm not sure what else I can do. Perhaps this is God's way of telling you it's time to start fresh somewhere else. Sometimes the Lord closes one door so that he can open another." Walking back to her wagon, Evelyn felt the weight of her isolation more keenly than ever. These people, the sheriff, the banker, the preacher, they weren't cruel. They were simply indifferent, and in some ways that was worse than cruelty. At least cruelty acknowledged that she existed, that she mattered enough to hate. Indifference suggested that she'd already become invisible, already ceased to matter in any meaningful way. She was loading her few purchases into the wagon when she saw him, Jack McCrae, leading a horse down the street toward the livery stable. He moved with the easy grace of a man comfortable with animals, his weathered hat pulled low against the sun. There was something about him that drew her attention, something beyond his obvious competence with horses. Perhaps it was the way he carried himself, straight-backed but not arrogant, confident but not cocky, or perhaps it was the way he treated the horse he was leading, with gentle patience and quiet authority. Whatever it was, watching him made her think of Thomas, of the way her husband had possessed that same quiet strength. The idea that had been forming in her mind for days suddenly crystallized into something concrete and terrifying. She needed protection. She needed someone who would stand with her against men like Brennan, someone who couldn't be bought or intimidated. She needed a man's name and a man's strength to shield her from the forces that were closing in. Jack McCrae was young, probably 23 or 24. He was also, by all accounts, a drifter with a questionable past. But he was here, he was available, and he was, she suspected, the kind of man who might be willing to make an unconventional arrangement if the terms were right. The proposal that was taking shape in her mind was scandalous, desperate, and probably foolish. But as she sat in her wagon watching the young cowboy tend to his horse, Evelyn realized that scandal was a luxury she could no longer afford. She'd already lost her reputation. Now she needed to save her life. That evening, she sat at her kitchen table and wrote out the terms of what she would offer him. Not a real marriage, as she wasn't ready for that, might never be ready for that again, but a partnership. a business arrangement that would give him a home and her the protection she needed. It wasn't love, but it might be survival. And sometimes, she thought as she sealed the letter, survival was enough. The Silver Dollar Saloon was not a place where respectable women ventured, especially not alone, and certainly not at dusk when the drinking was starting in earnest. But Evelyn Carr was no longer concerned with respectability. She tied her horse to the hitching post and straightened her shoulders, preparing herself for what she was about to do. The saloon was thick with smoke and the low murmur of men's voices. Conversation stuttered and died as she entered, all eyes turning to watch the scandal-ridden widow who had just walked into their masculine refuge. She ignored the stares, the whispered comments, the way some of the men shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. She had come here with a purpose, and she intended to see it through. Jack McCrae sat alone at a corner table, nursing a cup of coffee, while others around him drank whiskey and beer. He looked up as she approached, his expression unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. Up close, she could see the weathered lines around his eyes, the careful stillness of a man who had learned to keep his thoughts hidden. "Mrs. Carr," he said, rising politely from his chair. "This is unexpected." "Mr. McCrae." She took the chair across from him, acutely aware of the dozens of eyes still watching them. "I have a proposition for you." His eyebrows rose slightly, but he said nothing. In the lamplight, she could see that he was younger than she'd initially thought, probably closer to 23 than 24. But there was something in his face, a kind of weathered wisdom that spoke of experiences beyond his years. "I need your help," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm prepared to offer you something in return, something significant." Jack leaned back in his chair, studying her with those calm grey eyes. "What kind of help?" "The kind that comes with a ring and a name," she said, the words tumbling out before she could lose her nerve. "I'm proposing marriage, Mr. McCrae, a business arrangement that would benefit us both." The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever. Around them, the saloon continued its evening rhythm, but at their table, time seemed suspended. Jack's expression didn't change, but she saw something flicker behind his eye, surprise, perhaps, or confusion. "A business arrangement," he repeated slowly. "Yes." She reached into her reticule and pulled out a small objector-carved wooden token, worn smooth by handling. "I know about your commitment to sobriety, Mr. McCrae. I've watched you these past weeks, seen how you carry yourself, how you treat your animals. You're a man trying to build something better from whatever came before." Jack's hand moved unconsciously toward the token, then stopped. "Where did you get that?" "Sarah Martinez at the boarding house. She mentioned you'd been asking about work, about finding a place to settle down. She also mentioned that you carry a reminder of your commitment to stay away from drink." He was quiet for a long moment, then reached across the table and took the token from her hand. It was carved from oak, worn smooth by years of handling, with a simple cross etched into one side. "This is mine. How did you—" "I asked her to show it to me. I wanted to understand what kind of man I might be dealing with." Evelyn leaned forward, her voice urgent now. "I need protection, Mr. McCrae. I need someone who will stand with me against men who want to take what's mine. In return, I can offer you a home, a chance to build something permanent, a place where your past doesn't matter." Jack turned the token over in his hands, studying it as if he'd never seen it before. "You don't know anything about my past." "I know enough. I know you're not drinking anymore. I know you work hard and treat people with respect. I know you're not from around here, which means you might be willing to look past the things people say about me." "And what do people say about you?" Evelyn felt heat rise in her cheeks. "They say I'm a woman of loose morals who seduced a good man into an improper marriage. They say I'm a scandal and a shame to the community. They say I got what I deserved when Thomas died." Jack's expression hardened. "People say a lot of things. Most of it's not worth the breath it takes to speak it. You're not shocked by my reputation?" "I'm more shocked by your proposal." He leaned back in his chair, the token still in his hands. "You're asking me to marry you for protection. What's threatening you?" She told him about the railroad, about Brennan's visit, about the survey stakes and the veiled threats. She told him about her failed attempts to find help in town, about the isolation that had made her vulnerable to men who saw her as an easy target. "So you need a husband," Jack said when she finished. "Any husband." "Not any husband. You." She met his gaze directly. "I've watched you, Mr. McCrae. You're not like the other men in this town. You don't look at me with pity or judgment. You don't seem to care about gossip or reputation. And you're—" She paused, searching for the right words. "You're strong enough to stand up to men like Brennan, but gentle enough that I wouldn't fear you myself." Jack was quiet for a long time, turning the token over and over in his hands. Finally, he looked up at her. "What exactly are you proposing? The terms, I mean." "A marriage of convenience. You would live at my ranch, work the land, help me defend what's mine. In return, you would have a home, a stake in the property, and the respectability that comes with being a married man. We would be partners, not husband and wife in the traditional sense." "Partners," he repeated thoughtfully. "Yes, I'm not offering love, Mr. McCrae. I'm not even sure I'm capable of that anymore. But I'm offering partnership, mutual respect, and the chance for both of us to build something better than what we have now." Jack stood up suddenly, pacing to the window that looked out onto the darkening street. "You don't know me, Mrs. Carr. You don't know what I've done, where I've been, what I'm running from. Are you running from the law? No. Are you running from another woman? No. Then I don't need to know the rest. We all have things we'd rather forget, Mr. McCrae. I'm offering you a chance to leave yours behind." He turned back to her, and she saw something in his face that she hadn't expected, not surprise or confusion, but something that might have been hope. "You're serious about this?" "Completely serious. And you think I'm the kind of man who would take advantage of a woman's desperation?" The question stung, but she forced herself to consider it honestly. "I think you're the kind of man who would honor an agreement, whatever form it takes. I think you're the kind of man who would protect what's his, even if it came to him through unusual circumstances." Jack returned to his chair, sitting down heavily. "I ain't in the business of selling my name, ma'am," he said slowly, "but I reckon I might be in the business of earning yours." The words hit her like a physical blow. In all her planning, all her careful consideration of how this conversation might go, she had never expected that response. She had expected negotiation, questions about terms and conditions, perhaps even rejection. She had not expected him to turn her proposal into something that sounded almost like a promise. "What does that mean?" she asked quietly. "It means I'm not interested in a marriage of convenience. If I'm going to be your husband, Mrs. Carr, I'm going to be your husband. Not a hired hand with a ring, not a business partner with legal papers. A husband." "I don't understand." Jack leaned forward, his grey eyes serious. "I'm saying that if you want my protection, my name, my strength, then you'll have it. All of it. But not as part of some arrangement where we live like strangers sharing a house. If we do this, we do it right." Evelyn felt her heart racing. "Mr. McCrae, I'm not sure I'm ready for—" "I'm not talking about rushing into anything," he interrupted gently. "I'm talking about intention, about building something real between us, even if it starts as something practical. I'm talking about the possibility that this arrangement might become something more than just survival." She stared at him, this young man who had just turned her carefully planned proposition into something entirely different, something that terrified and intrigued her in equal measure. "Think about it," Jack said, standing up and placing the wooden token back in his pocket. "If you still want to make this arrangement, come find me tomorrow. But understand what you're asking for, Mrs. Carr. You're not just asking for a name, you're asking for a life, and I'm not interested in half measures." He touched the brim of his hat and walked away, leaving her alone at the table with her thoughts and the sudden, startling realization that she might have gotten far more than she'd bargained for. Jack McCrae arrived at the ranch the next morning with everything he owned packed into a single canvas bag tied to his saddle. The simplicity of it struck Evelyn as both admirable and heartbreaking, a man's entire life reduced to what could fit in a space smaller than her laundry basket. She watched him from the kitchen window as he surveyed the property, his movements careful and deliberate, like someone taking inventory of a new responsibility. She had spent the night alternating between resolve and panic, second-guessing her decision a dozen times before dawn. But when she saw him ride up the dusty track in the early morning light, she felt something settle in her chestnut peace, exactly, but a kind of determined calm. She had made her choice. Now she would live with the consequences. "Mr. McCrae," she called out, stepping onto the porch. "I wasn't sure you'd come." He dismounted and approached, his hat in his hands. "I gave it considerable thought, Mrs. Carr. If you're still willing, I'd like to accept your proposal. And you understand the terms, what I'm offering and what I'm asking in return." "I understand what you think you're offering," he said, and she heard an echo of the previous night's conversation in his voice. "But I meant what I said. If we're going to do this, we're going to do it right." She nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure what right meant in their circumstances. "The barn has a loft where you can sleep," she said. "There's fresh straw and blankets. It's not much, but it's private and clean." Jack looked toward the barn, then back at her. "That'll do fine for now, but Mrs. Caravellan, if we're going to be married, eventually that arrangement will need to change." Heat rose in her cheeks at the implication. "Eventually," she agreed quietly, "but not immediately." "Not immediately," he confirmed. "I'm not a man who forces himself where he's not wanted, but I am a man who expects honesty from his wife. If you're not ready for a real marriage, then say so. If you never think you will be, then say that too. I won't enter into this arrangement under false pretenses." The directness of his question caught her off guard. She had expected awkwardness, perhaps some uncomfortable negotiations about boundaries and expectations. She had not expected this kind of straightforward honesty that demanded the same in return. "I don't know," she admitted. Thomas was. Thomas was the only man I ever loved. The only man I ever. I don't know if I can feel that way about anyone else." "I'm not asking you to love me," Jack said gently. "I'm asking if you're willing to try to build something with me, something that might grow into more than just a business arrangement." She studied his face, looking for signs of deception or manipulation. But his grey eyes were steady, patient, giving her time to consider her answer. "I'm willing to try," she said finally, "but I can't promise anything beyond that. That's all I'm asking for. A chance." They were married 3 days later by Justice of the Peace Samuel Reynolds, with his wife Martha serving as witness. It was a brief, business-like ceremony conducted in the Reynolds parlor, lasting perhaps 10 minutes from start to finish. Evelyn wore her best dresser, simple blue cotton that had been her Sunday church dress before she'd stopped attending services. Jack wore clean clothes and a string tie, his hair neatly combed and his boots polished. There were no flowers, no music, no celebration. Just two people making a legal commitment for reasons that had more to do with survival than romance. When Reynolds pronounced them husband and wife, Jack kissed her cheek with gentle formality, his lips barely brushing her skin. It was the first time a man had touched her, even so innocently, since Thomas's death. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts. It wasn't until they were turning into the track that led to the house that Jack spoke. "There's something you should know about me," he said. "Something I should have told you before we did this." Evelyn felt her stomach tighten. "What is it?" "I used to drink. A lot. For a long time, it was the only way I could get through the day. I did things when I was drinking that I'm not proud of, said things that hurt people, became someone I didn't recognize. But you stopped. 2 years ago. Haven't touched a drop since. But the wanting doesn't go away, Evelyn. It gets easier, but it never completely goes away. I carry that token you saw as a reminder of what I was and what I don't want to be again." She considered this revelation, understanding now why he had seemed older than his years. "What made you stop?" Jack was quiet for a long moment. "I hurt someone who didn't deserve it, someone who was trying to help me. I woke up the next morning and realized that if I kept going the way I was going to destroy everything good in my life, so I stopped. And you haven't been tempted since? I've been tempted every day, but I've had reasons to stay sober. Good reasons. And now I have another one. They had reached the house, and Jack dismounted to help her down from the wagon. His hands were gentle but sure as he lifted her, and for a moment she found herself acutely aware of his strength, his nearness, the way he smelled of leather and soap and the outdoors. "What reason is that?" she asked when her feet were safely on the ground. "You," he said simply. "This place. The chance to build something worthwhile." Over the following days, they began to establish a rhythm of coexistence that was both easier and more complicated than Evelyn had expected. Jack proved to be a capable worker, rising before dawn to tend to the horses and cattle, repairing fences that had been neglected for too long, clearing brush from areas that had grown wild since Thomas's death. He worked with quiet efficiency, never asking for direction but somehow knowing exactly what needed to be done. In the evenings, they shared meals at the kitchen table, their conversation careful and polite. Jack asked about the ranch's history, about Thomas's plans for the property, about the practical challenges of running cattle in this part of Texas. Evelyn found herself talking more than she had in years, drawing out memories and knowledge she thought she had forgotten. He was, she discovered, a good listener. He asked thoughtful questions and remembered details from previous conversations. When she mentioned that Thomas had planned to expand the garden behind the house, Jack spent the next morning clearing weeds and preparing the soil. When she worried aloud about a fence post that was leaning at a dangerous angle, she found it repaired and reinforced by the end of the day. But it was the small things that surprised her most. The way he automatically took the heavier buckets when they went to the well together. The way he stood when she entered a room, as if she were a lady worthy of respect rather than a scandal-ridden widow. The way he said thank you when she served his meals, as if her cooking were a gift rather than an obligation. Thomas's tools still hung in the barn, exactly where he had left them 4 years ago. Evelyn had never been able to bring herself to move them or give them away. They seemed too much a part of him, too connected to the dreams they had shared. But watching Jack work around them, carefully using what he needed and respectfully returning everything to its proper place, she began to see them differently. Not as monuments to loss, but as instruments waiting to fulfill their purpose. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the prairie, Jack mentioned that he had seen riders on the far edge of the property. 3 men, he said, watching the house through field glasses. They rode off when they saw me coming. Evelyn felt the familiar twist of fear in her stomach. Brennan's men? Most likely, testing to see how things have changed now that you're not alone. And what do you think they concluded? Jack leaned back in his chair, his eyes still scanning the horizon. I think they concluded that you've got yourself a husband who notices things and isn't easily intimidated. Whether that's enough to make them back off remains to be seen. Are you worried? I'm cautious. There's a difference. He turned to look at her. I meant what I said, Evelyn. I'll protect what's mine. And like it or not, this place is mine now. You're mine now. The possessive note in his voice should have bothered her, but instead it sent an unexpected warmth through her chest. It had been so long since anyone had claimed her, since anyone had considered her worth protecting. And what does that make you? She asked quietly. Yours, he said without hesitation. If you want me to be. That night, lying in her bed while Jack slept in the barn loft, Evelyn found herself thinking about the way he had said that word, yours. There had been no hesitation, no qualification, no attempt to maintain emotional distance. Just a simple statement of fact that carried implications she wasn't ready to examine too closely. But for the first time in 3 years, she fell asleep without checking the locks on her doors or listening for sounds of approaching trouble. For the first time since Thomas's death, she felt safe. 3 weeks into their marriage, Evelyn discovered that Jack McCrae had opinions about China. She was washing dishes after their evening meal when he mentioned, almost casually, that she should use the good plates more often. The observation caught her off guard. She hadn't realized he'd noticed that she'd been serving their meals on the everyday pottery, while her mother's delicate china set gathered dust in the cupboard. Those plates in the cabinet, he said. drying the cup she handed him. "They're beautiful. Seems a shame to keep them hidden away." Evelyn paused in her washing, soap bubbles clinging to her hands. "They were my mother's. She brought them from Virginia when she married my father. I've been saving them for—" She stopped, realizing she wasn't sure what she'd been saving them for. Special occasions that never came. Important guests who never visited. "For what?" Jack asked gently. "I don't know anymore." She looked toward the cabinet where the china sat wrapped in cloth, protected and unused. "Thomas always said we should use them for Sunday dinners, but I was afraid they'd get broken. They're all I have left of her." Jack set down the cup and turned to face her fully. "Maybe that's exactly why you should use them. Maybe keeping them locked away is the real way to lose them." That Sunday, they ate their dinner from the china plate's delicate porcelain, painted with tiny blue flowers that had seemed almost too beautiful to touch. Jack handled them with the same careful respect he showed everything else of value, and Evelyn found herself remembering her mother's voice, explaining how to hold a teacup properly, how to arrange flowers in the matching vase, how to make even simple meals feel like celebrations. It was during these quiet domestic moments that their conversation began to deepen. Jack told her about his childhood in Arkansas, about the farm his family had lost during the economic troubles of the 1870s, about the wandering that had followed. He spoke carefully about his drinking years, never offering excuses, but helping her understand the loneliness and purposelessness that had driven him to seek oblivion in a bottle. "I wasn't a mean drunk," he said one evening as they sat on the porch. "I was a sad one, the kind that sits in the corner and drinks until the world goes away. But that almost made it worse, because people felt sorry for me instead of being afraid of me. They kept trying to help, and I kept disappointing them." "What changed?" Evelyn asked. Jack was quiet for a long time, his fingers unconsciously reaching for the token in his pocket. "There was a woman in Kansas, Mary Campbell. She ran a boarding house where I stayed for a few months. She was a widow, maybe 45, with 2 grown sons. She took it upon herself to try to save me." Evelyn felt an unexpected stab of something that might have been jealousy. "Did you love her?" "I thought I did. She was kind to me, patient. She'd make me coffee when I was hungover, listen to me ramble about my troubles, try to convince me I was worth saving. For a while I thought maybe she was right." "What happened?" "I stole from her." The words came out flat, matter of fact. She'd been putting aside money to bring one of her sons back from California, kept it in a tin box under her bed. I knew where it was, and one night when I was desperate for drink and out of money, I took it, all of it. Evelyn waited, sensing there was more to the story. She never called the sheriff, never even confronted me about it, just looked at me the next morning with these disappointed eyes and asked if I needed anything else before I left town. That's when I knew I'd become someone I couldn't live with anymore. "So you stopped drinking?" "So I stopped drinking, and I found a way to pay her back, every penny, though it took me almost a year, sent it with a letter, but I never heard back from her. Don't blame her for that." These revelations came slowly, shared during evening conversations that grew longer and more personal as the weeks passed. In return, Evelyn found herself talking about Thomas in ways she never had before, not just about their brief happiness, but about the loneliness that had preceded it, about her fears that she'd been too old, too set in her ways, too independent to be a good wife. "He used to say I thought too much," she admitted one night. "That I worried about things that might never happen instead of enjoying what was right in front of me." Was he right? Probably. I spent our whole marriage waiting for something to go wrong, and then something did. Jack reached across the small space between their chairs and touched her hand briefly. "That doesn't mean you caused it." The physical contact was fleeting, barely lasting a second, but it left Evelyn acutely aware of how long it had been since anyone had offered her comfort through touch. Jack seemed to realize what he'd done and pulled his hand back, but not before she saw something in his expression that made her heart skip. It was around this time that their domestic partnership began to show results beyond mere survival. The ranch was thriving under Jack's careful attention. Fences were mended, cattle were healthier, and the garden behind the house was producing more vegetables than Evelyn had seen since Thomas's death. Jack had even begun talking about expanding their livestock, about improvements that could increase their income and security. But their success was drawing attention they didn't want. Brennan's men had been seen on the property twice more, always watching from a distance, always disappearing when Jack rode out to confront them. The pressure was subtle, but persistent, a reminder that their problems hadn't disappeared just because Evelyn was no longer alone. The first real test came on a Thursday afternoon when Brennan himself rode up to the house. Evelyn was hanging laundry when she saw him approaching, and her stomach immediately tightened with familiar fear. But this time, she wasn't alone. Jack emerged from the barn at the sound of hoofbeats, moving with the kind of casual alertness that suggested he'd been expecting this visit. "Mr. and Mrs. McCrae," Brennan said, dismounting from his horse with deliberate slowness. "Congratulations on your recent marriage. I must say, it was quite a surprise to everyone in town." "Mr. Brennan," Jack replied, his voice perfectly polite. "What can we do for you?" "Well, I was hoping to speak with Mrs. McCrae about our previous conversation, about the generous offer I made for her property. My wife's business is my business now," Jack said smoothly, "and we're not interested in selling." Brennan's smile was cold. "I see. Well, Mr. McCrae, you're new to this area. You might not understand the complexities of the situation. This railroad project is going to happen whether your wife cooperates or not. It would be in everyone's best interest to reach an amicable agreement. And if we don't, well, then I suppose we'll have to let the lawyers and the courts sort it out. Of course, legal proceedings can be expensive and time-consuming. And sometimes accidents happen while people are distracted by legal troubles." The threat was delivered with the same pleasant tone Brennan had used during his previous visit, but this time Jack was there to hear it. Evelyn watched her husband's expression remain perfectly calm, but she noticed his hands had moved to rest casually on his gun belt. "Mr. Brennan," Jack said quietly, "I think you should leave now." "I'm simply trying to conduct business, Mr. McCrae." "No, you're threatening my wife and threatening my property. I consider that unfriendly behavior." There was something in Jack's voice, a flatness, a stillness that made Brennan's confident expression falter slightly. For the first time since she'd known him, the Land Speculator looked uncertain. "You're making a mistake, McCrae. I'm offering you a fair price for land that's going to be taken anyway. You'd be wise to consider it carefully." "I've considered it. The answer is no." After Brennan left, Evelyn found herself shaking with a combination of relief and residual fear. Jack noticed immediately, approaching her with the kind of careful concern he might show a spooked horse. "You all right?" "He scares me," she admitted. "The way he talks, the things he doesn't quite say. I know he's dangerous." "He is dangerous," Jack agreed, "but he's also a coward. Men like that prefer intimidation to actual confrontation. As long as we stand firm, as long as he knows we won't be easily pushed around, he'll look for easier targets. And if he doesn't," Jack's expression hardened, "then we'll deal with that when it happens. But Evelyn, you need to understand something. I meant what I said when I married you. This is my home now, my land, my wife. I won't let anyone take what's mine." That night, for the first time since their marriage, Jack didn't go to the barn after dinner. Instead, he settled into Thomas's old chair by the fireplace, cleaning his rifle with methodical precision. The message was clear: he was staying close to the house, ready for whatever might come. Evelyn went to bed with the sound of him moving quietly through the house, checking locks and windows, taking the kind of precautions that came naturally to a man who had lived with danger before. She should have been frightened by the reminder that their situation was becoming more serious. Instead, she found herself comforted by the knowledge that Jack was there, that she was no longer facing these threats alone. But as she lay in the darkness listening to the unfamiliar sounds of someone else in her house, she realized that her feelings about her husband were becoming more complicated than simple gratitude. The way he'd stood up to Brennan, the quiet confidence with which he'd claimed her as his wife, the careful tenderness he showed in their daily interactions, all of it was working its way past the barriers she'd built around her heart. And that, she thought as sleep finally claimed her, might be the most dangerous development of all. The wooden horse was no bigger than Evelyn's palm, carved with such delicate precision that she could see the individual strands of the mane, the gentle curve of the neck, the way the legs were positioned as if the animal were caught mid-gallop. She discovered it on the kitchen table one morning, sitting beside her coffee cup like a small miracle. "Jack," she called, but there was no answer. Through the window, she could see him working with the horses in the corral, his movements easy and practiced as he gentled a particularly skittish mare. She picked up the carving, marveling at the smoothness of the wood, the way it seemed to capture motion in stillness. When he came in for breakfast, she was still holding it. "It's beautiful," she said simply. Jack glanced at the horse, then at her face, and she saw something that might have been embarrassment flicker across his features. "It's for Sarah Martinez's boy. He's been asking his mama for a toy horse, but money's tight at the boarding house. You made this for a child you barely know. Jimmy's a good kid, helps his mother with chores, never complains. Figured he deserved something nice." Evelyn studied her husband's face, seeing something in his expression that made her chest tighten with an emotion she couldn't quite name. "How long did this take you?" "Few evenings. I like working with my hands when I need to think." She thought about those evenings, about Jack sitting by the fire in the parlor while she worked on her mending, both of them comfortable in the kind of companionable silence that had developed between them. She had assumed he was simply resting, but apparently he had been creating something beautiful for a child who would treasure it. "What do you think about when you're carving?" she asked. Jack poured himself coffee, considering the question. "Different things, sometimes about the wood, about finding the shape that's already hidden inside it. Sometimes about the person it's for, what would make them smile, what they need, sometimes about nothing at all." That afternoon, they drove into town together to deliver the horse. It was Evelyn's first time in Cedar Falls since their marriage, and she noticed immediately how differently people looked at her now. Instead of the barely concealed hostility or embarrassed pity she had grown accustomed to, she saw something approaching respect. Not warmth, perhaps, but acknowledgement that she was no longer the isolated, defenseless woman she had been. Jack's presence changed the dynamic of every interaction. When they stopped at the general store, Harold Whimsy actually smiled when he greeted them, asking about their plans for the ranch, commenting favorably on the improvements Jack had been making. At the post office, Mrs. Fletcher inquired politely about Evelyn's health and mentioned that her apple preserves had been much missed at the church socials. "People are different with you here," Evelyn observed as they walked toward the boarding house. "People respect strength," Jack replied. "They respect someone who stands up for what's his. And they respect the fact that you chose me despite whatever stories they might have heard about my past." "What stories?" "The usual ones. That I'm a drifter, a drunk, probably dangerous. That you married me out of desperation, and I married you for your land." He glanced at her sideways. "Are any of those true?" Evelyn considered the question seriously. "The desperation part, probably. I was running out of options when I approached you. But the rest—" She paused. "I don't think you're dangerous to anyone who doesn't deserve it. And I don't think you care about the land except as a place to build something with me. And the drunk part, that's in the past. The man I married doesn't drink." Jack stopped walking and turned to face her fully. "How can you be so sure about that? You barely know me." "I know enough." She met his gaze steadily. "I know you keep your word. I know you work harder than anyone has a right to expect. I know you're kind to children and animals and women who have nowhere else to turn. That's enough for me to know." Something shifted in Jack's expression, surprise, perhaps, or gratitude. "Most people aren't so quick to give me the benefit of the doubt. Most people didn't need you the way I did." They found Sarah Martinez hanging laundry behind the boarding house, her 6-year-old son Jimmy helping by handing her clothespins. The boy's face lit up when he saw them approaching, though his greeting was shy. "Mr. McCrae, Mrs. McCrae," Sarah smiled warmly. "How good to see you both." Jack crouched down to Jimmy's eye level and pulled the wooden horse from his pocket. "I made something for you, son. Your mama mentioned you'd been wanting a horse of your own." Jimmy's eyes went wide as he took the carving, turning it over in his small hands with the kind of reverence children reserved for truly precious things. "It's perfect," he whispered. "Look, Mama, look at his mane." Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she watched her son examine every detail of the carving. "Mr. McCrae, this is too generous. We can't accept." "Course you can," Jack said gently. "A boy needs a good horse, even if it's just a wooden one." As they drove home, Evelyn found herself studying her husband's profile, thinking about the man who would spend hours carving a toy for a child he barely knew, who would insist on delivering it personally, who would brush off gratitude as if kindness were the most natural thing in the world. "You're a good man, Jack McCrae," she said quietly. He was quiet for so long she thought he might not respond. Finally he said, "I'm trying to be. Wasn't always. None of us were always who we are now." That evening, they established a new routine. After dinner, Jack would settle by the fire with a piece of wood and his carving knife, while Evelyn worked on mending or read aloud from one of Thomas's books. It was peaceful, domestic, the kind of quiet companionship she had thought she might never experience again. But their contentment was fragile, threatened by forces beyond their control. 2 days after their trip to town, they woke to find their water trough poisoned, the dead fish floating on the surface, a clear message that their enemies were growing bolder. A week later, a section of fence was cut during the night, allowing several head of cattle to wander onto the road where they caused a minor accident. Each incident was small enough to be dismissed as bad luck or carelessness, but taken together, they formed a pattern of escalating harassment clearly designed to wear down their resolve. Jack dealt with each problem methodically, repairing damage and increasing security, but Evelyn could see the tension building in his shoulders, the way his eyes constantly scanned the horizon for signs of trouble. The psychological pressure was perhaps worse than the physical threats. They were constantly on guard, constantly waiting for the next incident. Their home, which had begun to feel like a sanctuary, now felt like a fortress under siege. It was during this time that their relationship deepened in ways Evelyn hadn't expected. Facing external threats together had created an intimacy born of shared purpose and mutual dependence. They moved through their days like a team, anticipating each other's needs, communicating with looks and gestures as much as words. One evening, as Jack cleaned his rifle while she prepared dinner, Evelyn realized that the careful distance they had maintained since their marriage was gradually dissolving. They stood closer now when they talked, touched more casually his hand on her back as he passed behind her chair, her fingers briefly covering his when she handed him his coffee. The change was subtle but unmistakable, and it frightened her almost as much as Brennan's threats. She had married Jack for protection, but she was beginning to feel things for him that had nothing to do with safety and everything to do with the way he made her laugh, the way he listened when she talked, the way he looked at her sometimes, as if she was something precious worth protecting. But it was the night she found him sitting on the porch steps, staring out at the darkness with his rifle across his knees, that she realized how deeply her feelings had changed. "Can't sleep?" she asked, settling beside him. "Someone's out there," he said quietly. "Been watching the house for the past hour. They're keeping their distance, but they're there." Evelyn felt the familiar chill of fear, but it was tempered by something else, anger. "This has to stop, Jack. We can't live like this forever." "I know." He turned to look at her, his face serious in the moonlight. "Evelyn, I want you to understand something. If this escalates, if they decide to make a real move against us, it's going to get dangerous. More dangerous than it already is. Are you suggesting I should accept Brennan's offer, give up and leave? I'm suggesting you should know what you're choosing, what we're both choosing." She was quiet for a moment, considering his words. Then she reached over and placed her hand on his arm, feeling the solid warmth of him beneath her fingers. "I'm choosing this place. I'm choosing you, whatever comes with that." Jack covered her hand with his own, and they sat there in the darkness, united in their determination to fight for what they had built together. But as the night wore on and the unseen watchers eventually faded back into the prairie, Evelyn realized that what they were fighting for had become something much more than just land and security. They were fighting for the chance to discover what their marriage might become if given the time and space to grow. They were fighting for a future neither of them had dared to imagine when they'd made their practical arrangement in the Silver Dollar Saloon. They were fighting for love, even if neither of them was quite ready to call it that yet. The photograph was tucked between the pages of a book about horse training that Jack had borrowed from the small collection in Thomas's study. Evelyn discovered it by accident when the book fell from her hands as she was dusting the shelves, the small rectangle of cardboard fluttering to the floor like a fallen leaf. At first glance, it appeared to be a military photograph, two young soldiers in Union uniforms standing beside a cannon, their faces serious beneath their caps. But as Evelyn picked it up and looked more closely, her breath caught in her throat. One of the faces was unmistakably familiar, though it belonged to a man at least 20 years younger than she had ever known him. Thomas. Her Thomas, barely more than a boy, standing with his arm around the shoulders of another young soldier who looked remarkably like Jack, she whispered, though she was alone in the study. The resemblance was unmistakable, the same grey eyes, the same strong jaw, the same way of holding his shoulders. But it couldn't be. Jack, this photograph was clearly from the war, probably taken in the early 1860s, which would have made Jack a child at the time. Yet the similarity was so striking that Evelyn felt her hands begin to shake as she examined the image more closely. On the back, in Thomas's careful handwriting, were the words, Tom Carr and Jake McCrae, 5th Texas Infantry, Shiloh, April 1862. Jake McCrae, not Jack McCrae. Evelyn sank into Thomas's chair, staring at the photograph with growing understanding and horror. Jack hadn't simply wandered into Cedar Falls by chance. He hadn't chosen to stay because of work opportunities or her marriage proposal. He had come here deliberately, looking for something or someone. He had come looking for Thomas. The pieces began falling into place with sickening clarity. Jack's immediate familiarity with the ranch layout, as if he had heard it described before. His knowledge of Thomas's habits and preferences, the way he seemed to know exactly which tools to use and where to find them. His careful questions about Thomas's death, asked so casually that she had never suspected they were anything more than polite interest. And his response to her marriage proposal, not the surprise or confusion she would have expected from a stranger, but something that had seemed almost like recognition, as if he had been waiting for exactly that opportunity. The study door opened behind her, and she heard Jack's familiar footsteps crossing the room. She didn't turn around, couldn't bear to face him yet, but she felt him stop when he saw what she was holding. "Where did you find that?" His voice was carefully neutral, but she could hear the tension beneath it. "It fell out of one of Thomas's books." She finally turned to face him, the photograph still clutched in her trembling hands. "Jake McCrae, that's your real name, isn't it?" Jack's expression was unreadable, but she saw his shoulders sag slightly, as if he had been carrying a weight he was finally ready to set down. "Yes." "You knew my husband?" "Yes." "You came here looking for him?" Jack was quiet for a long moment, then nodded. "I came here looking for Thomas Carr, but I was 4 years too late." Evelyn felt a wave of nausea wash over her. "How long have you known? How long have you been lying to me?" "I haven't lied to you, Evelyn. I just haven't told you everything." "That's the same thing." She stood up abruptly, anger overriding her shock. "You let me think you were a stranger. You let me believe." She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. What had she believed? That their meeting was chance? That his interest in her was genuine? That their marriage meant something more than just another deception? "Please," Jack said quietly. "Let me explain." "Explain what?" "How you've been manipulating me from the beginning. How you married me under false pretenses. How everything I thought I knew about you was a lie." "Not everything. Not the important things." She stared at him. This man she had begun to trust, begun to care for, begun to love. "What important things? Your name is a lie. Your reason for being here is a lie. What else is there?" Jack moved closer, his hands held out as if approaching a frightened animal. "My feelings for you are real. What we've built together is real. The man I am when I'm with you, that's real. How can I believe anything you say now? Because you know me, Evelyn. You know who I am, what kind of man I am. That hasn't changed. I thought I knew Thomas too, but apparently I didn't know about you, about whatever connection you two had. What else didn't I know? What else are you hiding from me?" Jack sat down heavily in the chair across from her, suddenly looking older than his years. "Thomas saved my life during the war, more than once. We served together for 2 years, from Shiloh to the end. He was the best man I ever knew." Evelyn felt her anger begin to give way to confusion. "Then why did you change your name? Why did you let me think you were a stranger?" "Because I was ashamed." The words came out raw, painful. "Because Thomas died believing I was someone I wasn't, and I've spent the last 4 years trying to become the man he thought I was." "I don't understand." Jack reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. "This is a letter Thomas wrote to me just before he mustered out. He was going home to Texas, to a woman he'd been corresponding with. He was going to ask her to marry him." Evelyn's breath caught. "Me? You? He talked about you constantly during those last months, about how beautiful you were, how intelligent, how kind. About the life he wanted to build with you, the ranch he was going to buy, the children he hoped you'd have together." Jack's voice was thick with emotion. "He made me promise that if anything ever happened to him, I'd find you, make sure you were all right. So you came here to check on me?" "I came here to fulfill a promise to a dead friend. But I was a drunk when Thomas knew me, Evelyn, a different man than the one sitting here now. I was afraid that if I told you the truth, you'd see me the way I was then, instead of who I've become." Evelyn unfolded the letter with trembling hands. Thomas's familiar handwriting filled the page, and she recognized immediately the tone of voice she remembered from their courtship letters, warm, thoughtful, full of hope for the future. "Jake," the letter began, "I'm writing this the night before we muster out, and I want you to have it in case our paths don't cross again soon. I know these last 2 years have been hard on you, brother. I know you've seen too much, done too much, lost too much. But I also know the man you are underneath all that pain, and I want you to remember that man when this war is over. I'm going home to marry a woman named Evelyn Hartwell. I've told you about her before. She's everything good in this world, everything worth fighting for. If something happens to me, if I don't make it home to her, I need you to promise me you'll find her. Not to court her, she deserves better than a broken-down soldier with too many ghosts. But to make sure she's all right, that she's happy, that she has what she needs. You're a good man, Jack McCrae, even if you don't believe it right now. Someday you're going to find your way back to that goodness, and when you do, you're going to make some lucky woman very happy. I just hope I'm around to see it. Your brother in arms, Tom Carr." Evelyn read the letter twice, tears blurring her vision. She could hear Thomas's voice in every word, could see his face as he wrote about his hopes for both her and Jack. But she could also see the weight of guilt and obligation that had driven Jack to seek her out years later. "He died before you could keep your promise," she said finally. "I tried to find you right after the war, but I wasn't in any condition to help anyone. The drinking had gotten bad, and I was moving from town to town, running from my own ghosts. By the time I got myself together enough to start looking seriously, you'd already married Thomas and moved away from where your family used to live. So you spent years searching for me, on and off. Whenever I was sober enough to remember the promise, clear-headed enough to ask the right questions. I finally tracked you to Cedar Falls about 6 months ago, but when I arrived, I discovered that Thomas had died, and you were living alone on that ranch." Evelyn felt a chill run through her. "You've been watching me for 6 months?" "Not watching. Trying to figure out how to approach you, how to fulfill a promise to a dead man without making things worse for you. Every time I thought about introducing myself, I'd remember what I was like when Thomas knew me, and I'd lose my nerve. But you stayed in the area. I took work at the Riverside Ranch, so I could keep an eye on you from a distance. Make sure you were safe, that you had what you needed. I told myself that was enough, that I was keeping my promise to Thomas without interfering in your life. Until I approached you at the saloon. Jack nodded. When you made that proposal, when you asked me to marry you for protection, it felt like fate, like Thomas was reaching out from beyond the grave to make sure you got the help you needed. But it also felt like a betrayal, because I knew I wasn't being honest about why I was there. Evelyn set the letter aside and looked at this man she had married, trying to reconcile the stranger she had thought she was helping with the friend Thomas had loved enough to entrust with her welfare. What else did he tell you about me? Everything. How you took care of your father until he died. How you were too independent for most of the men in town, too smart for your own good. How you had a sharp tongue but a kind heart. How you made the best apple pie in 3 counties and could outride most men when you put your mind to it. Despite everything, Evelyn felt a small smile tug at her lips. He told you about my riding? He told me about the time you raced him to the river on your father's horse and won. Said he knew right then that he was going to marry you, because any woman who could ride like that and still look like a lady when she dismounted was someone special. The memory hit her like a physical blow. She remembered that day, the exhilaration of the race, the way Thomas had looked at her afterward with something approaching awe, the moment when she'd known their friendship was turning into something deeper. He really told you all of that? He talked about you every night for months. It was like he was already living the life he wanted to have with you, just by talking about it. Sometimes I thought he loved the idea of you more than he could ever love the real thing. But then I met you, and I realized he didn't know the half of it. The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Evelyn stared at Jack, seeing him clearly for the first time as the stranger who had agreed to marry her for practical reasons, but as the man Thomas had loved like a brother, the man Thomas had trusted to care for her if something happened to him. So our marriage, she said slowly, was it just about keeping a promise to Thomas? Jack met her gaze directly. It started that way. But Evelyn, what I feel for you now, what we've built together, that has nothing to do with Thomas and everything to do with who you are. I didn't fall in love with Thomas's stories about you. I fell in love with the woman who proposed to a stranger in a saloon, who trusted me enough to share her home, who has more courage in her little finger than most men have in their whole bodies. You love me? The words came out as barely a whisper. I love you, and I know I should have told you the truth from the beginning, but I was afraid you'd see me as just another obligation, another responsibility left behind by your husband. I wanted you to choose me for who I am now, not for who I was to Thomas. Evelyn stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the land she and Jack had been working together, the home they had been building. Everything she thought she knew had been turned upside down, but somehow the fundamental truth remained unchanged. Jack was still the man who had protected her, worked beside her, made her feel safe and valued and cherished. I need time to think about this, she said finally. I understand, but Evelyn, whatever you decide about us, about our marriage, I want you to know that Thomas was right about you. You are everything good in this world, everything worth fighting for. And if I've done anything to make you doubt that, if I've hurt you by keeping the truth from you, then I'm sorrier than I know how to say. That night, Evelyn lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the photograph of Thomas and Jake on the bedside table beside her. She thought about the young men in the picture, about the friendship that had been forged in the crucible of war, about the promise that had brought Jack to her door years later. But mostly she thought about the man sleeping in the barn, the man who had carved toys for children and stood up to bullies and made her feel like a woman worth protecting. Whatever his reasons for coming to Cedar Falls, whatever promises had motivated him initially, the Jack McCrae she had married was real. The man she had fallen in love with was real. The question now was whether she could forgive him for not trusting her with the truth from the beginning, and whether she could trust him with her heart, knowing that their relationship had been built on a foundation of secrets and half-truths. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and reminding her that winter was coming. Soon, the choice would be made for them. Brennan would make his final move, and they would either stand together or fall apart. But first, she had to decide if the man she had married was worth fighting for, deception and all. As dawn approached, Evelyn realized that the answer had been there all along, written in every kind gesture, every moment of protection, every evening spent in comfortable companionship. Jack McCready or Jack McCreath's name didn't matter. What mattered was the man he had chosen to become, and the life they could build together if she was brave enough to forgive him. But forgiveness, she knew, would have to be earned, and that conversation would have to wait until she was ready to have it. 3 days passed in careful silence. Evelyn went about her daily routines with mechanical precision, feeding the chickens, tending the garden, preparing meals that she and Jack ate in uncomfortable quiet. He had moved back to the barn without being asked, understanding that she needed space to process what she had learned. But she could feel him watching her, could sense his worry in the way he lingered near the house longer than necessary, the way he found excuses to check on her throughout the day. On the 4th morning, she found Thomas's military medal on the kitchen table beside her coffee cup. It was a simple bronze disc, tarnished with age, suspended from a faded blue ribbon. She had seen it before, years ago, when Thomas had shown her the small collection of items he'd kept from the war. But she had never really understood its significance, beyond the fact that it represented his service to his country. Now, holding it in her hands, she understood it was something much more personal than that. Jack appeared in the doorway, his hat in his hands. "Thomas should have gotten a dozen medals for what he did during the war," he said quietly. "But that one he earned pulling 3 men out of a burning artillery wagon. I was one of them." Evelyn looked up at him, seeing the weight of memory in his grey eyes. "He saved your life. More than once. At Shiloh, when I took shrapnel in my leg and couldn't walk. At Stones River, when I was pinned down by Confederate sharpshooters. And at the end, when I was so drunk I could barely stand, he pulled me out of a fight that would have gotten me killed." Jack's voice was thick with emotion. He never asked for anything in return. Never made me feel like I owed him. That's just who he was. "But you felt like you owed him anyway." "I felt like I owed him everything. My life, my chance at something better, my hope that I could become a man worth knowing. And when he died, before I could repay that debt, before I could even thank him properly." Jack trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Evelyn set the medal down carefully, understanding now the weight of obligation that had driven Jack to seek her out. "So you came here to take care of his widow? To honor his memory by protecting what he loved?" "I came here to keep a promise, but I stayed because of you. Because somewhere along the way, keeping Thomas's memory alive became less important than building a life with the woman he was smart enough to love." The honesty in his voice made her chest tighten with emotion. "I need to know something, Jack. If Thomas was still alive, if you'd found us happily married, what would you have done?" Jack considered the question carefully. "I would have introduced myself, thanked him for saving my life, made sure you both had whatever you needed to be happy. And then I would have moved on, knowing that my debt was paid and my promise was kept. You wouldn't have stayed?" "I couldn't have stayed, not loving you the way I do now." The admission came out raw, honest. "But Thomas was gone when I found you, and you were alone and in danger. It felt like providence, like he was reaching out from wherever he was to make sure you got the protection you needed." Evelyn stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the land that had become the center of their conflict with Brennan. "Do you think he would approve? Of us, I mean, of what we've become? I think Thomas wanted nothing more than for both of us to be happy, and I think he'd be glad that we found that happiness with each other." She turned back to face him, this man who had carried the weight of a dead friend's trust for 4 years, who had changed his name and his life in pursuit of a promise. "I'm not angry about the promise, Jack. I'm angry that you didn't trust me enough to tell me the truth. I was afraid you'd think less of me, afraid you'd see me as the broken-down drunk Thomas knew instead of the man I've tried to become. And now I'm terrified that I've lost you because I was too much of a coward to be honest from the beginning." Evelyn picked up the medal again, feeling its weight in her palm. Thomas never told me much about the war. He said it was too hard to talk about, too much death and suffering. But he did tell me about a friend who saved his sanity when everything else was falling apart. He said this friend had a good heart but was lost, and he prayed every night that the friend would find his way to peace. Jack's expression tightened. He prayed for me? He prayed for you. Even after the war ended, even after you disappeared from his life, he still worried about you. Still hoped you'd find your way. She looked up at Jack, seeing the emotion in his face. I think he'd be glad to know that his prayers were answered. Evelyn, but I'm still angry with you, she continued, cutting him off. Not for keeping Thomas's promise, not for coming here to check on me, but for not trusting me with the truth once we started building something together. For letting me believe our marriage was just a business arrangement when it meant so much more to you. Jack nodded, accepting her anger as his due. You have every right to be angry, and you have every right to ask me to leave if you can't forgive me. Is that what you want, to leave? God, no, I want to stay. I want to fight for this place, for you, for the life we've been building, but only if you want me to stay, only if you think you can trust me again. Before Evelyn could answer, the sound of approaching riders interrupted their conversation. Through the window, they could see a cloud of dust rising from the road, multiple horses moving fast toward the ranch. Jack was beside her in an instant, his body tense with alertness. How many? She asked. 6, maybe 8. Too many for a social call. Jack moved toward the door, then stopped and turned back to her. Evelyn, whatever happens here, whatever you decide about us, I need you to know that everything I told you about my feelings was true. I love you. That was never part of any promise or obligation. That's just the truth. The riders were close enough now that they could see individual faces. Brennan was in the lead, flanked by men who looked more like hired guns than legitimate ranch hands. They were armed, and they moved with the purposeful confidence of men who had come to finish what they'd started. They're not here to negotiate, Jack said grimly. No, they're not. Evelyn felt a strange calm settle over her, the clarity that sometimes came in moments of crisis. Jack, whatever happened between us, whatever I decide about forgiveness and trust, that's for later. Right now, these men want to take what's ours, and I won't let that happen. Jack looked at her with something approaching admiration. What are you saying? I'm saying that this is our land, our home, and we're going to defend it. She moved to the gun cabinet that had belonged to Thomas, pulling out the rifle she had learned to use during her years of isolation. Whatever else you are, Jack McCrae, you're my husband, and these men are threatening what we've built together. You're sure about this? Once we make this stand, there's no going back. Evelyn checked the rifle's load with steady hands. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. The riders had reached the yard now, spreading out in a semicircle around the house with practiced precision. Brennan dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate and threatening. In the growing light of morning, his intentions were clear. This wasn't about negotiation or intimidation anymore. This was about taking what he wanted by force. Jack positioned himself by the front window, his own rifle ready. Whatever happens, Evelyn, stay behind cover. These men won't hesitate to hurt you if they think it serves their purpose. And whatever happens, she replied, moving to the side window where she could watch the barn and the eastern approach. Remember that I meant what I said. This is our home, our fight. Brennan's voice carried clearly across the yard. McCrae, Mrs. McCrae, come out and let's settle this like civilized people. Jack called back without showing himself. We've got nothing to settle, Brennan. This is private property, and you're not welcome here. I'm afraid I have to disagree. You see, I've got legal documents here that say otherwise. The railroad company has filed a claim on this land, and the county judge has issued an eviction notice. You've got 1 hour to pack your belongings and clear out. Let's see those documents, Evelyn shouted, surprising Jack with the steel in her voice. Why don't you come out here and we'll discuss it properly? Why don't you come to the front door like a gentleman and show us your paperwork? There was a long pause. and Evelyn could see Brennan conferring with his men. Finally, he called out again. "I'm afraid we're past the point of genteel conversation, Mrs. McCrae. You've got 1 hour. After that, we'll be forced to remove you." Jack caught Evelyn's eye across the room. "They don't have any legal documents. If they did, they'd have brought the sheriff to serve them. This is just intimidation backed up by guns. So what do? We make it clear that we're not going anywhere, and we hope that when the shooting starts, we're better at it than they are." As if to punctuate his words, one of Brennan's men fired a warning shot into the air. The message was clear, the talking was over. Whatever came next would be decided by strength, determination, and the willingness to fight for what mattered most. Evelyn thought about Thomas, about the dreams they had shared for this place. She thought about Jack, about the life they had been building together despite its complicated beginnings. And she thought about the choice that lay before them: surrender everything they had worked for, or stand and fight for the right to call this place home. The decision, when it came, was surprisingly easy. She had lost too much already to surrender without a fight. And beside her, she had a man who understood the value of loyalty, the weight of promises, and the price of standing up for what was right. Outside, Brennan was shouting new threats, but Evelyn barely heard them. She was focused on the rifle in her hands, on the man beside her, and on the knowledge that whatever came next, they would face it together. The battle for their home was about to begin. The morning sun cast long shadows across the yard as Brennan's men took their positions, transforming the peaceful ranch into a battlefield. Jack moved through the house with practiced efficiency, checking sight lines and defensive positions with the kind of tactical thinking that spoke of hard experience. His rifle, cleaned and ready, rested easy in his hands as he assessed their situation. 8 men, he said quietly, peering through the front window. 2 by the barn, 3 behind the water trough, 1 in the corral, and 2 with Brennan near the road. They're spread out to prevent us from running, but that also means they can't concentrate their fire. Evelyn positioned herself at the side window, her own weapon steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "What's the plan?" "We make them pay for every inch. These men are hired guns, not soldiers. They're used to intimidating people into submission, not fighting people who shoot back. If we can make this costly enough, they might decide the job isn't worth the risk. And if they don't?" Jack's expression was grim but determined. "Then we make our stand here and hope we're tougher than they are." Brennan's voice carried across the yard again. "Time's up, McCrae. Come out now, and we'll let you ride away with your lives." Instead of answering, Jack fired a single shot that kicked up dust inches from Brennan's feet. The Land Speculator scrambled backward, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "That's our answer," Jack called out. "Anyone else wants to discuss terms, they can do it from behind cover." The response was immediate and violent. Brennan's men opened fire simultaneously, filling the air with the crack of rifles and the whistle of bullets. Windows shattered, wood splintered, and the peaceful morning erupted into chaos. But Jack had chosen their positions well. The house's thick log walls absorbed most of the initial volley, and the shooters outside found themselves firing at shadows and empty windows. Jack moved from room to room with fluid grace, appearing at unexpected angles to send precise shots toward his attackers. His first shot took down the man in the corral, who had exposed himself while trying to get a better angle on the house. The hired gun dropped with a cry of pain, clutching his shoulder as he scrambled for cover behind a fence post. "One down," Jack muttered, already moving to the next window. Evelyn found herself falling into the rhythm of the fight, waiting for targets to present themselves, breathing steadily as Thomas had taught her during their brief marriage. When one of the men by the barn made the mistake of showing himself too long, she was ready. Her shot caught him in the leg, sending him tumbling backward with a shout of surprise and pain. "Good shooting," Jack said approvingly. "They're learning to respect us." The gunfight settled into a deadly pattern of movement and counter-movement. Brennan's men would advance, seeking better positions, and Jack would drive them back with precisely placed shots. They tried rushing the house twice, but Jack's superior marksmanship and knowledge of the terrain forced them to retreat both times, leaving wounded men behind. But the attackers had advantages too. They had more ammunition, more men, and time was on their side. As the morning wore on, Jack's movements became more conservative, his shots more carefully chosen. He was beginning to run low on bullets. "How many rounds do you have left?" Evelyn asked during a brief lull in the fighting. "Maybe a dozen. You?" "8. Jack nodded grimly. "We need to make them count." It was then that they heard the sound that changed everything, the thunder of approaching hoofbeats from the direction of town. A new group of riders was approaching fast, raising a cloud of dust that could be seen for miles. Brennan apparently heard it too. "Finish this," he shouted to his men. "Now!" The hired guns responded with renewed aggression, rushing the house from multiple directions simultaneously. Jack appeared at the front window and began firing rapidly, his shots finding their marks with deadly precision. But there were too many targets, too many angles of attack. One of the attackers made it to the side of the house, pressing himself against the wall where Jack couldn't get a clear shot. Evelyn watched through her window as the man began working his way toward the front door, clearly intending to force his way inside. Without thinking, she opened the side window and leaned out, her rifle aimed at the man below. "Stop right there." The hired gun spun toward her, his own weapon coming up, but Evelyn was ready. Her shot took him center mass, dropping him to the ground where he lay still. It was the first time she had ever shot a man, and the reality of it hit her like a physical blow. "Evelyn!" Jack was beside her instantly, pulling her back from the window as return fire shattered the frame where her head had been. "Are you hit?" "No, I'm." She looked down at the motionless figure below, feeling sick. "Is he?" "Don't think about it now," Jack said firmly. "Think about staying alive." The sound of hoofbeats was getting closer, and Brennan's remaining men were clearly getting desperate. They launched one final assault, all of them rushing the house together in a coordinated attack that should have overwhelmed the defenders. But Jack was ready. He had been saving his last few rounds for exactly this moment, and he used them with surgical precision. His first shot dropped the man leading the charge. His second sent another attacker diving for cover. His third and fourth scattered the rest, breaking their momentum and sending them scrambling for safety. In the sudden quiet that followed, the approaching riders finally came into view. It wasn't more of Brennan's men, it was a group of townspeople led by Sheriff Morrison, all of them armed and looking grim. "Brennan!" Morrison's voice carried clearly across the battlefield. "By the authority of the county court, I'm ordering you and your men to stand down." Brennan emerged from his cover, his face red with rage and frustration. "Sheriff, these people are squatting on railroad property. I'm exercising my legal rights." "The railroad company's claim was rejected by the territorial court this morning," Morrison replied. "Turns out they were trying to seize land they had no legal right to. And more importantly, there are witnesses who swear you've been using illegal means to force people off their property." Behind the sheriff, Evelyn could see familiar faces: Sarah Martinez from the boarding house, Harold Whimsy from the general store, even Reverend Patterson from the church. People who had been content to ignore her troubles when she was alone and vulnerable, but who had apparently found their courage when she proved she was willing to fight for herself. Brennan's remaining men were looking uncertain now, their eyes darting between their employer and the armed townspeople who outnumbered them 3-1. One by one, they began lowering their weapons. "This isn't over, McCrae." Brennan snarled as Morrison and his men moved to surround the hired guns. "You think winning one fight makes you safe? You think these people really care about you?" Jack stepped out onto the porch, his rifle still ready, but pointed toward the ground. "I think we've proved we can take care of ourselves, Brennan. And I think you've proved you're nothing but a bully who folds when someone stands up to him." As the sheriff and his men took control of the situation, Evelyn found herself shaking with reaction. The battle was over, but the cost was just beginning to sink in. There were wounded men in her yard, blood on her hands, and the knowledge that she had been willing to kill to protect what was hers. But there was also Jack, standing strong and protective on their porch, scanning the crowd of townspeople who had come to their aid. Whatever secrets he had kept, whatever complicated motives had brought him to her door, he had proved himself when it mattered most. He had stood with her, fought beside her, and helped her defend their home. The question now was whether that was enough to rebuild the trust between them, and whether they could find a way to move forward from the foundation of violence and revelation that had marked this day. Sheriff Morrison dismounted slowly, his weathered face grave as he surveyed the aftermath of the gunfight. 3 of Brennan's men were wounded, 1 seriously, and the man Evelyn had shot lay motionless near the side of the house. The sheriff walked over to check on him, then looked up at Evelyn with something that might have been respect. "Clean shot, Mrs. McCrae. He'll live, but he won't be causing trouble for a while." Relief flooded through her. She had never wanted to kill anyone, even someone who was trying to harm her and Jack. Thank God. "Ma'am." Morrison tipped his hat to her, then turned to address the crowd of townspeople who had accompanied him. "Doc Patterson, we're going to need you to look at these wounded men. Sarah, could you and some of the ladies help get them somewhere where the doc can work on them properly?" As the townspeople moved to assist the wounded, Morrison approached Jack and Evelyn on the porch. "I owe you both an apology. Should have put a stop to Brennan's tactics weeks ago, but I was afraid of going up against the railroad interests without solid proof." "What changed your mind?" Jack asked. "This morning I got a visit from a territorial judge who'd been investigating railroad land claims. Turns out Brennan and his associates have been using forged documents and bribes to seize property all across Texas. The whole operation is under federal investigation now." Evelyn felt a weight lift from her shoulders. "So our land is safe?" "Your land was never in danger, Mrs. McCrae. The railroad company never had a legitimate claim on it. But more than that, Brennan's been indicted on charges of fraud, extortion, and conspiracy. He'll be lucky if he doesn't spend the next 10 years in federal prison." Brennan himself was being loaded into a wagon under armed guard, his face a mask of rage and defeat. As the wagon pulled away, he shouted back at them, "You haven't heard the last of this. I have friends, influence." "Not anymore, you don't," Morrison called after him. "Your friends are cutting deals with federal prosecutors as fast as they can. You're finished, Brennan." As the crowd began to disperse, taking the wounded men to town for medical treatment, several of the townspeople approached Jack and Evelyn. Harold Whimsy from the general store was the first to speak. "Mrs. McCrae, Mr. McCrae, I wanted to apologize for the way this town treated you. We should have stood up to Brennan from the beginning." "We all should have," added Reverend Patterson, his face showing genuine remorse. "Fear and prejudice made cowards of us all. But what you did here today, standing up for your home, fighting for what's right, that showed us what real courage looks like." Sarah Martinez stepped forward with tears in her eyes. "Jimmy wanted me to give you this," she said, pressing something into Jack's hand. It was the wooden horse he had carved, now bearing a small addition, a tiny rider, carved from a different piece of wood. He said every horse needs a cowboy, and every cowboy needs to know he has friends. Jack looked down at the carving, his throat working with emotion. "Tell Jimmy thank you, and tell him he'll always have friends here." As the townspeople gradually departed, Jack and Evelyn were left alone in their yard, surrounded by the debris of battle, but also by the profound silence that comes after great storms. The ranch deed lay on the kitchen table where Morrison had left it, after verifying its legitimacy. Their legal claim to the land was now beyond question. "It's really over," Evelyn said, hardly daring to believe it. "This part is," Jack agreed, "but there's still the matter of us, of what happens now that the immediate danger is past." Evelyn looked at this man, who had stood beside her in battle, who had risked his life to protect their home, who had proved his loyalty in the most concrete way possible. The anger she had felt about his deception was still there, but it was tempered now by understanding and by the undeniable evidence of his character. "Jack," she said quietly, "I need you to understand something. I'm not angry that you knew Thomas. I'm not angry that you came here because of a promise you made to him. I'm angry that you didn't trust me enough to tell me the truth. I know, and I'm sorry for that, sorrier than I know how to say. But I also need you to understand something else. She stepped closer to him, close enough to see the exhaustion and hope warring in his grey eyes. What we just went through together, the way you fought for this place, for me that matters more than how we started. That's who you really are. Jack reached out tentatively, and when she didn't pull away, he cupped her face gently in his hands. I love you, Evelyn. Not because of any promise to Thomas, not because of guilt or obligation. I love you because you're the strongest, most courageous woman I've ever known. And if you'll have me, if you can forgive me for not being honest from the beginning, I want to spend the rest of my life proving that love to you. Evelyn felt tears spring to her eye-steers, of relief, of exhaustion, of emotions too complex to name. I love you too, Jack, Jake, whoever you are, whoever you choose to be. I love the man who carved toys for children, who stood up to bullies, who fought beside me when everything was on the line. Even though I lied to you, you didn't lie. You just didn't tell me everything. And maybe I understand why. Maybe if I had been carrying the weight of guilt and obligation that you've been carrying, I would have done the same thing. Jack's thumb brushed away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. I don't deserve your forgiveness. Maybe not, but you have it anyway. Because that's what love is, forgiving each other, for being human, for being flawed, for making mistakes out of fear instead of wisdom. They stood there in the aftermath of battle, holding each other as the sun climbed higher in the Texas sky. Around them, their land stretched out peaceful and secure, no longer threatened by forces beyond their control. The house behind them bore the scars of gunfire, but it was still standing, still theirs, still home. There's one more thing, Jack said quietly. The deed to this property, it's in both our names now. Morrison made sure of that when he was verifying the paperwork. This ranch belongs to both of us, legally and completely. Evelyn pulled back to look at him. What does that mean? It means we're true partners now, in everything. It means this marriage isn't just about protection or convenience anymore. It's about building something together, something that belongs to both of us. And if I want more than that, if I want a real marriage, in every sense. Jack's expression grew serious, tender. Then that's what we'll have, but only when you're ready, only when you're sure. I won't push you into anything, Evelyn. We have time now, time to get to know each other honestly, time to build trust, time to let whatever this is between us grow into what it's meant to be. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Evelyn realized that the conversation they'd been avoiding had finally been had. Not in the way she'd expected, not in the careful, controlled manner she'd planned, but in the raw honesty that comes after surviving something terrible together. Jack, she said, breaking the comfortable silence, what was your real name during the war, before you became Jack McCrae? Jacob William McCready, Jake to my friends. He smiled slightly. Thomas used to say it was a good, solid name for a good, solid man, said I should never be ashamed of it. Jacob, she repeated, tasting the name. I like it, but I also like Jack McCreath, man who married me, who protected me, who chose to build a life with me. Which one do you want to be? Jacob considered the question seriously. I think I want to be both. Jacob McCready was Thomas's friend, the man who made a promise and kept it. Jack McCrae is your husband, the man who's building a future with you. Maybe it's time to stop running from one to become the other. Jacob McCrae, then, a combination of who you were and who you've become. Jacob McCrae, he agreed. I like the sound of that. As night fell over the ranch, they remained on the porch, planning improvements to the property, discussing dreams they had both been afraid to voice before. The battle with Brennan was over, but the real work was just beginning, the work of building a marriage based on honesty, trust, and the kind of love that could weather any storm. In the distance, coyotes called to each other across the prairie, their voices wild and free. But here on their porch, surrounded by land that was truly theirs, Jacob and Evelyn McCrae were building something civilized and lasting, a partnership that honored the past while reaching boldly toward the future. The deed to their property lay safely inside, bearing both their names in official, unbreakable script. But the real documents that mattered were written in the promises they had made to each other, in the trust they were rebuilding, and in the love they had discovered in the most unlikely of circumstances. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new chances to prove their commitment to each other and to the life they were creating together. But tonight, they were simply a man and woman who had fought for their home and won, who had found love in the aftermath of deception and forgiveness, who had discovered that sometimes the most powerful bonds are forged not in perfect understanding, but in the willingness to fight for something worth keeping. The stars came out one by one above them, and still they sat together, comfortable in each other's presence, secure in the knowledge that whatever came next, they would face it as true partners. The lonely woman who had begged a cowboy to marry her was gone, replaced by someone stronger, more confident, more certain of her own worth. And the drifting young man with too many secrets had become someone grounded, purposeful, deserving of the love and trust he had been given. Their story was just beginning. 6 months later, Evelyn McCrae stood in the garden behind their house, watching her husband Jacob, she had learned to call him, though he answered to either name with equal warmth, work with a new colt in the corral. The spring air was sweet, with the scent of wildflowers and fresh growth, and the ranch bore no scars from the violence that had marked their beginning. They had rebuilt what was damaged, improved what was lacking, and created something that felt truly like home. The changes went deeper than mere repairs. Where once there had been isolation and fear, there was now connection and confidence. Neighbors stopped by regularly, no longer held back by scandal or judgment. The ranch had become a gathering place of sorts, where folks came to buy Jacob's beautifully trained horses or to seek Evelyn's advice on everything from difficult births in livestock to the best way to preserve vegetables for winter. She had discovered, somewhat to her surprise, that she had a gift for healing both animals and people. Word had spread about her skill with herbal remedies and her gentle way with frightened creatures. Just last week, she had helped birth a difficult foal at the Thompson Ranch, and the week before that, she had successfully treated a case of colic that had the veterinarian stumped. "You're becoming quite the local celebrity," Jacob had teased her after Doc Patterson had stopped by to consult with her about a particularly stubborn case of lung fever. "I learned from watching Thomas work with the animals," she had replied, "and from necessity. When you're alone for as long as I was, you learn to be resourceful." But she wasn't alone anymore. The simple gold bands they both wore now told a different story than the hasty marriage of convenience that had brought them together. These rings had been chosen together, blessed by Reverend Patterson in a quiet ceremony attended by their friends and neighbors. Sarah Martinez had served as matron of honor, and little Jimmy had carried the rings with the same careful dignity he brought to tending his wooden horse. The second wedding had been Jacob's idea. "I want to marry you again," he had said one evening as they sat planning improvements to the house. "Not out of desperation or obligation, but because I choose you, because I love you, because I want everyone to know that this marriage is real, that it's built on truth this time." Evelyn had been surprised by how much the gesture meant to her. Standing in the church with Jacob's hand in hers, speaking vows that came from the heart rather than necessity, she had felt a completeness she hadn't experienced since Thomas's death. This was her choice, freely made, based on knowledge rather than hope, grounded in trust that had been tested and proven strong. Their physical relationship had developed slowly, carefully, with the kind of patience and consideration that spoke to Jacob's deep respect for her autonomy. He had courted her as if they were new sweethearts rather than a married couple, bringing her wildflowers from the prairie, reading to her in the evenings, finding excuses to touch her hand or brush her hair back from her face. When she had finally invited him to share her bed, it had been her decision, made with full knowledge of what she was choosing and why. The intimacy they had discovered together was different from what she had shared with Thomasless. Desperate, perhaps, but deeper in some ways. There was a quality of gratitude in their lovemaking, an appreciation for what they had found together, despite the complicated path that had brought them to each other. Jacob loved her with the reverence of a man who had thought himself unworthy of such happiness, while she loved him with the confidence of a woman who knew her own worth and had chosen wisely. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew her attention to the road, where a familiar figure was riding toward the ranch. Sarah Martinez sat her horse with easy competence, a basket strapped to her saddle and a smile on her face. She had become Evelyn's closest friend over the past months, the two women bonding over shared experiences of widowhood and the challenges of making their own way in the world. "Afternoon, Evelyn," Sarah called as she dismounted. "I brought you those new seedlings I promised, and some news from town that I thought you'd want to hear." "Good news, I hope?" Evelyn wiped her hands on her apron and moved to help Sarah with her basket. "The best. Margaret Hutchins is leaving Cedar Falls. Apparently, her nephew in San Antonio has offered her a place with his family, and she's decided to accept." Evelyn felt a mixture of emotions at this news. Margaret had been the source of so much pain, the author of the scandal that had isolated her for years. But she also felt something approaching pity for the bitter woman who had found so little joy in life that destroying others had become her primary occupation. "I hope she finds peace there," Evelyn said finally. Sarah looked at her with admiration. "You're a better woman than I am, after what she put you through. That's in the past now. I have too much happiness in the present to waste time on old grievances." And it was true. Looking around at the thriving ranch, at her husband working patiently with his horses, at the garden that produced more than they could eat themselves, Evelyn felt a contentment she had never expected to experience again. The woman who had begged a young cowboy to marry her out of desperation had become someone who could afford to be generous, even to those who had wronged her. That evening, as they shared dinner from her mother's China platter tradition that had developed naturally after that first Sunday meal, Jacob told her about his plans for expanding their horse breeding operation. "Tom Richardson wants to contract with us for 6 horses next spring. Says our animals have the best temperament he's ever seen. And the army buyer from Fort Worth is interested in discussing a regular supply agreement." "That's wonderful," Evelyn said, though something in his tone suggested there was more to the story. "It would mean good money, steady income, security for our future." Jacob paused, setting down his fork. "It would also mean I'd be traveling more, maybe spending weeks at a time away from the ranch. And you're worried about leaving me alone." "I'm worried about a lot of things. About whether you'd be happy with me gone so much. About whether the business would grow too big, too fast. About whether success might change who we are together." Evelyn reached across the table and took his hand. "Jacob, a year ago I was alone and afraid, living on the charity of my neighbor's indifference. Now I'm a woman with skills, with friends, with a husband who loves and respects me. Do you really think I can't handle a few weeks of managing this ranch on my own?" He smiled at her tone. "When you put it like that. Besides," she continued, "I've been thinking about expansion too. Doc Patterson wants me to consider setting up a formal practice treating animals, maybe training other women in herbal medicine. If you're going to be traveling with the horses, I could use that time to build something of my own." Jacob's face lit up with genuine pride. "You never cease to amaze me, Mrs. McCrae. Most women would be content to simply be supported by their husband's success. I'm not most women, and I think that's one of the reasons you fell in love with me." "One of many reasons," he agreed, bringing her hand to his lips for a gentle kiss. As they prepared for bed that night, Evelyn found herself thinking about the journey that had brought them to this point. The desperate woman who had proposed marriage to a stranger felt like someone from another lifetime, someone she barely recognized. In her place was a woman who knew her own mind, who had built a life worth living, who had found love in the most unexpected circumstances. The wooden horse that had started Jacob's reputation as a carver sat on the mantelpiece now, returned to them by Jimmy Martinez when he outgrew it. Beside it sat other mementos of their life together, a pressed flower from their second wedding, a photograph taken at the church social last month, a small carved bird that Jacob had made for her birthday. These objects told the story of their marriage better than any words could. A relationship built on small kindnesses, shared struggles, and the gradual accumulation of trust and love. They had started with nothing but necessity and hope, and they had built something beautiful and lasting. As Jacob extinguished the lamp and joined her in their bed, Evelyn reflected on the unexpected ways life could change. She had thought her story was over when Thomas died, that her chance for happiness had passed with his death. Instead, she had discovered that life offered second chances, new beginnings, the possibility of finding love again in forms she had never imagined. "Jacob," she said quietly into the darkness. "Yes? Thank you." "For what?" "For keeping your promise to Thomas. For protecting me when I needed protection. For staying when you could have left. For loving me when I didn't think I was worthy of love." Jacob pulled her closer, his arms strong and warm around her. "Thank you for taking a chance on a broken-down cowboy with too many secrets, for seeing who I could become instead of just who I was, for making me want to be worthy of you." Outside their window, the Texas night was alive, with sound cattle lowing in the distance, the whisper of wind through prairie grass, the distant call of a night bird. But inside their home, there was only peace, contentment, and the quiet satisfaction of two people who had found exactly what they needed in each other. The lonely woman and the drifting cowboy were gone, replaced by Jacob and Evelyn McCrae, partners, lovers, friends, and guardians of a future they would build together. One day at a time, one choice at a time, one act of love at a time. Their story, which had begun with desperation and deception, had become something far richer and more beautiful than either of them had dared to hope. And as they settled into sleep in each other's arms, they knew that tomorrow would bring new opportunities to prove their love, to build their dreams, and to create a legacy that would honor both the past they had survived and the future they would shape together. In the end, the cowboy's answer had left her speechless, not because of what he had refused to give, but because of what he had chosen to offer. Instead, not just his name or his protection, but his heart, his future, and his unwavering commitment to earning her love every single day of their lives together.